Imagine a cold, dimly lit room where time has stopped completely. There is no clock on the wall, no calendar to mark the passing years. There is only a window with heavy iron bars, looking out onto a bleak, gray courtyard that remains the same, season after season. In this room, for 53 long years, a man sat alone on the edge of a metal bed. He stared at the peeling green paint on the walls, while the dust motes danced in the pale shafts of light. He was a ghost in the machine, a man who had been erased from the world of the living. To the doctors and nurses who walked past his heavy door, he was known only as Tamás. They saw him as a madman with no past, a confusing case who mumbled in a gibberish language that no one in the entire hospital could understand. While he sat in that isolation, the world outside exploded with change. Empires fell, men walked on the moon, the Berlin Wall rose and crumbled into dust, and the internet connected the globe. But this man missed it all, frozen like an insect in amber, trapped in a war that had ended half a century ago. This is the true story of Andras Toma, the soldier who went to fight in 1944 as a young boy and did not return home until the 21st century. It is the story of a life stolen by bureaucracy, and a memory recovered from the darkness. To understand the tragedy of the end, we must return to the innocence of the beginning. The year is 1944. The location is the small, sleepy village of Sziliambukor in eastern Hungary, a place of green fields and thatched cottages. Andras Toma was 19 years old, a strong young man with a life ahead of him. He was not a soldier by nature, he was a creator. He worked as a blacksmith's apprentice, spending his days amidst the smell of hot iron, hammering glowing metal on an anvil, with sparks flying around him in the workshop. He knew the names of every horse in the village and the sweet scent of apples in his father's orchard. He had never traveled far from home. He could not find Russia on a map, and he had no interest in the politics of distant nations. But the war has a way of finding those who try to hide from it. As the Soviet Red Army began to crush the Eastern Front, rolling inexorably toward the Hungarian borders, the government declared total mobilization. Soldiers arrived in the village at dawn. There was no time for long goodbyes. Andras was taken from his home, handed a heavy rifle he barely knew how to aim, and dressed in a stiff uniform that didn't quite fit his frame. He was loaded onto a military truck with other terrified boys. The convoy moved hundreds of miles north, away from the warm sun of Hungary and into the freezing hell of Poland. The landscape turned white and desolate, covered in deep snow and the black soot of burning cities. His war was short, brutal, and confusing. In January 1944, near the city of Krakow, the world turned into fire. Soviet artillery pulverized his regiment. Deafened by explosions and shivering in a trench, Andras realized there was no escape. Surrounded by the dead and dying, terrified and freezing, the young blacksmith raised his trembling hands in surrender. He hoped that capture would mean safety. He did not know it was the beginning of a 50-year nightmare. The prisoners were herded like cattle toward the train station. Andras was pushed into a wooden cattle car packed with hundreds of other defeated men. The heavy sliding doors were bolted shut, plunging them into darkness. The train rattled eastward for weeks, moving deeper into the vast, frozen heart of Russia. Inside the car, the air was thick with fear and sickness. Men died of typhus and starvation right next to him, their bodies growing cold in the crowded space. By the time the train stopped at the Boktygorsk camp near Leningrad, Andras was broken. He was delirious with fever, his lungs filled with fluid, his body shivering uncontrollably from pneumonia and exhaustion. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the damage in his mind. The shock of the bombardment, the starvation, and the terrifying isolation of being surrounded by a language he didn't understand shattered his sanity. He began to retreat inward. In 1947, Soviet authorities began repatriating prisoners of war. Doctors inspected the men. When they came to Andras, they found a man in a catatonic state, eyes wide and unseeing, unable to say his own name or stand in line. Instead of sending him home to his family, the bureaucratic machine made a fatal error. They decided he was useless for labor. They erased his status as a prisoner of war and reclassified him simply as a mental patient. He was put on another train, this time heading east, to a small, frozen town called Kotelnich, 800 kilometers from Moscow. The destination was a psychiatric hospital run by the secret police. The heavy iron gates of the hospital slammed shut behind him with a final, metallic clang. At that moment, Andras Toma effectively ceased to exist. His military papers were lost in the chaos. His name was misspelled in the ledger. He became a number. A body on a government cot. Under the diagnosis section of his new file, the Russian doctors wrote a single cold word: psychopathy. Later, they would change it to schizophrenia. Life in the Kotelnich Hospital was a loop of endless gray. Every day was exactly the same. Wake up. Eat a bowl of watery porridge. Swallow a handful of heavy sedatives. Sleep. Repeat. The doctors tried to speak to him in the early years. But Andras, traumatized and confused, spoke rapidly, swallowing his syllables. It was a specific, rural Hungarian dialect, but to the Russian doctors, it sounded like the gibberish of a madman. Soviet psychiatry in those years was not about healing, it was about containment. He was heavily medicated. Powerful drugs dulled his senses, made him compliant, and slowly eroded his memories like water wearing down a stone. Year after year, the memories faded. First, he forgot the faces of his friends. Then, the layout of his village. Finally, he forgot his own surname. He became simply Andras, the quiet man in the corner who smoked rolled cigarettes. His physical world shrank even further when an untreated infection in his leg turned into gangrene. The doctors had no choice but to amputate his leg. Now, a one-legged man, he couldn't even walk to the fence. He spent his days in a wheelchair or sitting on the floor, staring at the wall. Nurses came and went. Governments changed. The hospital walls were painted and peeled. And Andras remained, a fixture of the institution. Decades passed. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The Iron Curtain fell. But in the remote town of Kotelnich, nothing changed for the old man. He was now the hospital's oldest resident, a relic of a forgotten time. The turning point came half a century later, in the late 1990s. The hospital was under new management. A new chief doctor, examining the dusty archives, stumbled upon a yellowed file that made no sense. A patient who had been there since 1947? The doctor went to the ward and listened to the old man. He realized the gibberish had syntax. It had emotion. It wasn't random noise, it was a language. He suspected it might be Hungarian. Through a chain of contacts, they found a man named Karol Morvay, a linguist of Hungarian descent living in Russia. On August 11, 2000, Morvay entered the hospital ward to meet the mystery patient. Morvay pulled up a chair next to the 74-year-old amputee. The old man looked at him with cloudy, tired eyes. Morvay leaned in and spoke a sentence that shattered the silence of 50 years. "Hoggy Hivjak? What is your name?" Andras froze. His eyes suddenly focused. The fog of medication and time seemed to lift for a second. He looked at the stranger not with fear, but with recognition. He heard the sound of home. The conversation that followed was difficult. Andras didn't speak modern Hungarian. He spoke the language of the 1930s, frozen in time. He lisped because he had no teeth. But Morvay listened intently, recording every word. Andras couldn't remember his last name at first. But he remembered fragments of his past. He whispered about a man named Janos who had the best horse in the village. He spoke of a schoolhouse standing next to a church. He mentioned the distinct handle of his schoolteacher's cane. He described the exact shape of the blacksmith's anvil. These were not the hallucinations of a lunatic. They were the precise, preserved memories of a 19-year-old boy. The linguist pieced together the clues. He realized he was looking at a mental map of a specific region in Hungary. He was uncovering a life that had been interrupted in 1944. Once the identity was confirmed, the news shocked the world. "The last POW found alive," was the headline on every television screen. A special military plane was dispatched from Hungary to Russia to bring the lost soldier home. The footage of Andras being carried out of the hospital is haunting. He looks tiny and shrunken on the stretcher, clutching a plastic bag containing his only possessions, a pair of socks and an old razor. The flight to Budapest was a medical risk. Doctors feared the shock of the modern world might kill him. As he looked out the airplane window at the clouds, tears streamed down his face. He later said he thought he had died and was being taken to heaven. He landed in a Budapest he didn't recognize. The city was full of neon lights, traffic jams, and skyscrapers. He was taken to a military hospital for rehabilitation, where he had to relearn how to be a human being. He had to learn to sleep on a soft mattress instead of a hard cot. He had to learn to eat with a fork, not just a spoon. He stared at the color television for hours, mesmerized, unable to comprehend the moving pictures in the box. But the mystery wasn't fully solved. Who exactly was he? There were 82 families in Hungary with the surname Toma who had lost a son in the war. 82 mothers who had waited in vain. Scientists took DNA samples from Andras and began comparing them with potential relatives. It was a race against time to find his people before he died. And then, the computer confirmed a match. 99.99%. In the village of Suliambekar, an elderly woman named Anna Gabor and a man named Andras Toma received the news. They were Andras's half-siblings. They had thought he died in a Russian camp in 1945. Their father had spent decades standing by the garden gate, looking down the empty, dusty road, believing against all logic that his son would one day walk back home. He had died without knowing the truth. The reunion at the hospital was heartbreakingly beautiful. When Anna entered the room, Andras didn't recognize the elderly woman. But then she spoke. She used a childhood nickname only his family knew. The wall came down. The man who had been silent for half a century began to weep uncontrollably. He grabbed her hand and wouldn't let go. The memories flooded back: the apple tree, the broken fence, the neighbor's dog. The doctors called it a medical miracle. The mind, which they thought was destroyed by drugs and isolation, was healing itself through the power of human connection and love. Andras was brought home to his village. The Hungarian Ministry of Defense promoted him to sergeant major and paid him his accumulated salary for 53 years of service. It was a small fortune, enough to build him a comfortable new house. But money is a poor substitute for a life. Andras lived for 4 more years in the care of his sister. He was a quiet, gentle presence in the village. He spent his final years sitting on the porch, feeling the warm sun on his face, watching the flowers grow in the garden. He found peace in the simple things he had missed: the taste of fresh fruit, the sound of birds, the touch of a friendly hand. He rarely spoke of Russia. It was as if he decided to simply delete those 53 years, treating them like a long, dark nightmare that he had finally woken up from. Yet, the trauma lingered deep inside. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he would cry out in his sleep, thinking he was back in the cold ward of the Kotelnich Hospital. There is a bitter irony in his survival. Andras survived where millions died. He survived the bullets, the typhus, the starvation, and the asylum. He returned home. But the cost was everything. He never fell in love. He never held his own child. He never built a home with his own hands. His life was paused at age 19 and unpaused at age 74. The best years of his life were stolen by a clerical error. Andras Toma passed away in 2004. This time, there was no unmarked grave in the frozen ground. He was buried with full military honors, under the soil of his homeland, surrounded by the people who remembered him. His story forces us to ask a haunting question: how many others are still there? How many men and women are sitting in forgotten rooms, waiting for someone to ask the right question in the right language? We often say, "No one is forgotten." But the archive is a dark and vast place. It is our job to light a candle in that darkness. Andras Toma proved that no matter how deep the snow, or how high the walls, the human spirit waits to be found.